and 6, me, Mr. A, back with story time for another day. We're going to finish off chapter 13 of Over Sea Under Stone. Let's see if the Drew children can find the entrance to this cave with the Grail. Right then. So Barney's just put his shoe back on and they're hiking over the slippery stones. They splashed through the weed, keeping close to the cliff and catching nervously at the rock to keep their balance. Simon, first in line, reached out warily with his forward foot, stirring the water so that the seaweed swirled cold and clammy against his skin. The bottom of the pool seemed fairly smooth, and he went more confidently, with the others following behind. Then suddenly his probing foot met no resistance, and before he could throw his weight backwards he had slipped down waist-deep in water. Jane, last in line, squealed involuntarily as she saw him drop. Barney held out a hand to Simon, suddenly a much shorter figure than himself. "It's all right," Simon said, more surprised than damaged. After the first shock, the water felt pleasantly cold on his sun-baked legs. He moved carefully forward, and after a couple of steps felt rock against his knees under the water of the pool. He hauled himself up, splashing like a stranded fish, and in a few moments was only ankle-deep in water again. "It's a sort of underwater trough. It goes right up to the cliff. Be careful, Barney. Feel with your toes a bit further out and see if there are any footholds there. There might be some sticking up under the water like stepping stones. I went down before I had a chance to feel. If there aren't any, you'll just have to come across the way I did, only slower." Barney prodded carefully about with one foot beneath the water and its swaying carpet of seaweed, but even farther away from the cliff he could feel only the edge of the underwater ridge, and beyond it nothing. "I can't feel anything to tread on at all." "You'll have to go down then. Lower yourself into it." "We might as well have gone swimming after all," Barney said nervously. He crouched with both hands on the bottom until he was sitting in the water with his legs dangling over the hidden crevasse, and let himself slip down. The water was almost over his shoulders when he felt his feet on firm rock. He had forgotten how much taller Simon was. He waded across and Simon hauled him out into the shallow water. Barney's shorts, wet and dark, clung heavily to his thighs, and he bent to detach odd fronds of seaweed that had twined themselves round his legs. Almost at once he felt the heat of the sun begin to dry his skin, leaving behind only the rasp of salt. Jane followed in the same way, and together they splashed across the last few shallow feet of the pool to where the rocks jutted out dry among the brown mounds of seaweed again. "I do wish we knew about the tide," Simon said anxiously to Jane. Barney had gone eagerly slipping and slithering in the rocks ahead of them. Jane looked towards the sea. It lapped mildly against the edge of the rocks a few yards away, leaving a natural pathway all around the bottom of the cliff. "It certainly hasn't moved. It might even be going out still. I shouldn't worry yet. We must be nearly there." "Well, keep an eye on it. It's that deep bit I'm worried about. When the water does start coming in, it'll come up to the pool first of all, and it wouldn't have to fill it up very far for us not to be able to get back the way we came. It'd be over Barney's head in no time." Jane blanched and looked ahead at her younger brother, now scrambling on all fours. "Oh, Simon, do you think we should have left him behind?" Simon grinned. "I'd like to have seen you try. Don't worry, it'll be all right, just so long as we watch the tide." Looking back, Jane suddenly realised how far they had come. They stood now on the rocks at the very tip of the headland. The small, distant sounds of the land no longer drifted out from the beach, and there was nothing but the gentle sigh of the sea. It was almost as if they were cut off already. Then Barney yelled in excitement, "Hey, look! Quick, come here, I've found it!" He was standing close to the cliff, some yards ahead, almost hidden by a rock. They could see him pointing towards the cliff face. In an instant they had forgotten the tide, and they jumped and slithered over pools and rocks towards Barney, bladder wrack popping under their feet like machine gun fire. "It's not very big," he called as they came up. Simon and Jane saw the deep cleft in the rock only when they were very close. It was not the kind of cave they had pictured in their minds. Narrow and triangular, it rose barely high enough for Barney to stand upright inside, and they themselves would certainly have to crouch to go in. Rough boulders lay heaped round the entrance, and water dripped from wet green weed coating the roof. They could not see very far inside. Jane said doubtfully, "Are you sure this is it?" "Of course it is," Barney said positively. "There couldn't be more than one." "Well, I don't see why not." "Neither do I," Simon said. but I think this is the one all right. Look above. You can just sort of see a green triangle at the top of the cliff where the grass grows over the edge by the rocks. We must be almost directly in line with the place where that hole comes up out there. Jane looked and looked down again very quickly, shaken by the unnerving height of the cliff leaning over them out of the sky. I suppose so. Barney peered into the darkness. It isn't a cave at all, really, just a hole, like at the top. Poof! He sniffed critically. It smells all seaweedy and salty, and the sides are all wet and green and dripping. Good job we're wet already. I don't like it, Jane said suddenly, staring hard at the dark entrance, so small in the vast mass of the cliff. What do you mean you don't like it? It gives me the creeps. We can't go in there. You can't, you mean? Simon said. You'll have to keep watch in case the tide turns, but I can. What about me? Barney demanded indignantly. I found it. Do you want to? Said Jane in horror. With the Grail in there? Who wouldn't? Be much better if I tried. He said persuasively to Simon. I'm the smallest and it's jolly narrow. You might get stuck and never get out again. Oh, don't, said Jane. If you go in, I'm going in after you, Simon said. OK, Barney said cheerfully. He had been so unutterably relieved ever since he found himself free of the clutches of the sinister Mr. Hastings that nothing else in comparison seemed frightening at all. I wish we'd brought a flashlight, though. He gazed speculatively into the cave. Within a few feet of the entrance, it was black and impenetrable. I wish we'd brought a rope, said Jane unhappily. Then if you did get stuck, I could pull you out. Simon put his hands in his pocket, looking up at the sky, and began to whistle nonchalantly. They stared at him. Well, what's the matter with you? Good job someone in the family's got brains, Simon said. Who, you? I don't know what you'd do without me. Oh, come on, Jane said impatiently. You haven't got a rope or a flashlight, so don't pretend you have. I jolly nearly have. Simon delved into the pocket of his shorts. You know when we went through our pockets up there this morning to see if we had some string, and we only had that cotton of yours? Well, I thought we ought to be a bit better equipped just in case. So when we were back at the house, I pinched some of Father's fishing line. He didn't take it all with him. His hand emerged from his pocket, clutching a tightly wound wad of thin brown line. That's as tough as any rope. I never thought of that, Jane said with new respect. I've still got that old bit of candle too, but I bet you haven't got your matches. Jane groaned. No, I haven't. They were in my duffel, and I left it at home. Oh, bother. I thought you would, Simon said, and with the smug flourish of a conjurer, he produced a box of matches and the candle stump from his shirt pocket. Then his face fell. Oh gosh, they've got wet. They must have been splashed when I slipped in that pool. The wick of the candle's soaking. It won't be any good. Still, the matches are all right. They'll do fine, Barney said encouragingly. That's smashing. Come on. Simon took the telescope case from where he had tucked it under his arm and handed it to Jane. You'd better take charge of the manuscript, Janey. If I dropped it in there, we'd never find it again. He looked out again at the sea. The rocks where they stood were even more like a causeway here, stretching out almost flat from the base of the cliff into the water. Only one hump of grey rock stood alone near the entrance of the cave. The water still lapped gently at the edge, 6 or 7 yards away, no nearer and no further than it had been when they first left the beach. Simon wondered nervously how much time was left before the tide would turn. I reckon we've got about half an hour, he said slowly. After that we shall have to get away quick before the tide catches us. Come here, Barney, and hold still. He found the loose end of the roll of fishing line and tied it securely round Barney's waist. If you're going to go first, I can hold on to the line behind you. Do you think he ought to? Jane said. Barney turned round and glared at her. Well, I'm not awfully keen on the idea, said Simon, but he's right about it being narrow, and he may be the only one who can get properly inside. It's all right, I won't lose him. Here, he handed Jane the roll of line. Don't let it go slack. And don't keep it too tight, said Barney, making for the entrance, or you'll cut my middle in half. Jane looked at her watch. It's nearly 5 o'clock. When you've been in there 10 minutes, I'll pull the line twice to tell you. 10 minutes? Said Barney in scorn. We may have to go in for miles. You might suffocate, said poor Jane. That's a good idea, Simon said quickly, glancing at her face. You pull twice, and if I pull back twice, it means we're all right, but we're staying in there. If I pull 3 times, it means we're coming out. And if I pull 3 times, it means you've got to come out because the tide's turned. Fine. And 4 pulls from either end means a distress signal, not... Simon hastily, that there's going to be any need for it. All right, Jane said. Oh dear, don't be long. Well, we shall have to go slowly, but don't get in a flap, nothing's going to go wrong. Simon patted her on the back and followed as Barney, straining eagerly at the line round his waist like a dog on a leash, waved one hand briefly and disappeared into the mouth of the cave. Alright, that's the end of chapter 13. I'll be back again tomorrow with the start of chapter 14. And we'll see what happens in the cave. Will they find the Grail? Will they be caught by Mr. Hastings and the Witherses? Alright, take care everybody, have a great day. Bye bye.